Alright, my little goslings. If you didn't watch the first video and you're too lazy to do so now, here's what this series is about, here are the rules, and here's where we left off. No, I'm not going to keep it on screen for longer than that, and be sure to watch Leif's videos if you want more info on why I think the show needs a rewrite. Let's get this started. We begin by seeing the face of the envoy of Valinor. He has silver hair and bright eyes, and even seems to glow with a supernatural light. He steps forward and is greeted by Gil-galad, and the two begin to walk away. It's clear that the envoy is in some form of haste as he begins speaking with Gil-galad, who apologizes for the lack of preparation for his coming, and says that while they have only just now finished a feast, they would gladly prepare another for such an eminent guest. Furthermore, if I may be so bold, how shall I address my lord? Gil-galad says. The envoy states that he is to be called Elendil, for Manwë believed that the marvelous crafts of Ale alone would be sufficient for his mission. Even so, Gil-galad need not fret about preparation. He has urgent business of which he has only just enough time to briefly discuss with Gil-galad as it is. It is then that they come to the main courtyard. Elendil asks which path is the best route to the nearby Elvish realms, for he must deliver his message to them most of all. Gil-galad states that the southeast road through the great forests is likely the only one sufficient for any haste. Still, he adds, I would be much obliged if you could speak, however briefly, on your urgent business. What tidings from Valinor are so drastic as to require the Valar to send us an envoy? I hope that we have not done anything else to displease the great lords of the West. The envoy says that whether they have or have not, he was not told, for he has more important business than the issue of the Noldor staying in Middle-earth. Your world is fading, he says, a statement which Gil-galad and many of the elves around him are surprised to hear, until he looks down slightly, saying, I admit I've noticed the change myself. The world is indeed not as it once was. But Elendil contradicts such a modest statement. You do not understand, my friend. The world is not simply less than it was. It is fading. The corruption of Morgoth has seeped into the very heart of Arda itself. If something is not done to counteract this, even fair Linden will fade. He then points to the great tree at the center of the courtyard and calls everyone's attention to it. All the elves look and are horrified to see that several of the leaves have begun to wither, and the trunk and branches are less green than they were before. Verrix and his entourage are watching this with little understanding, having no conception of the significance of the tree, and having little or no understanding of the Elvish being spoken. Elrond, who is standing nearby, notices this and begins to explain everything to them. He tells them about how the great tree is, in many ways, the heart of this land, its roots stretching far throughout the Blue Mountains and nourishing them. It is likewise the oldest and loveliest of the trees in Linden, made in the image of Telperion himself, and cousin of Nimloth the Fair in Numenor. Therefore, the fact that even it is fading in the greatest of elven realms is cause for concern. Gil-galad moves to touch the tree, and we can see the sorrow on his face as he picks up one of the withering leaves. So it has come to this, he says under his breath. This is horrible, one of Verrix's assistants says to his king. I never could have imagined the elves would be fading. All the tales say they're immortal. Still, Verrix says, they are willing to teach us what we need, and we shall be thankful to them for their knowledge. Who knows, perhaps that envoy will manage to save everyone. He then looks and finds that the envoy has disappeared. He looks around and sees that everyone else is still contemplating the tree. He therefore speaks up and points out that the envoy has left. Gil-galad turns from the tree and looks about, realizing that Verrix is right. He is confused for a moment before merely shaking his head and declaring, the envoy has indeed left. Well, let us hope that he fulfills his task. He looks out at the sun, which has risen over the horizon in the distance, over the misty mountains. We then transition from this shot to another elf looking towards the rising sun. He is getting off a ship in a far more southern-looking climate. He has golden hair and rich armor, and likewise seems to shine with a certain supernatural presence, except this shining is more subtle, hidden, and can only be seen if one looks perceptively at the screen. He walks off the ship, seemingly expecting no great welcome, but nonetheless drawing stares from almost everyone who sees him. Men are baffled by his presence, elves seem somewhat troubled, and Harfoots are in complete awe. Among them is a Harfoot girl who is particularly interested in this stranger, following him for a while with a group of friends, and we find out based on their conversation that her name is Marigold. Marigold watches as the elf walks confidently, but still somewhat confusedly through the town. Eventually he is stopped by a group of Sylvan elves, who ask him what he is doing and where he is going. He attempts to speak to them, and they have some trouble understanding each other at first. Eventually the stranger figures out how to speak with them, them and begins asking them how to reach the other realms of the High Elves. The Sylvan Elves explain that it is not their place to discuss these sorts of matters with strangers. Therefore, they must wait until their commander returns from scouting, which they say could take several months. Still, they agree to take him to their tower to the south of the town. The stranger graciously accepts, and Marigold, after being pulled away by her friends, reluctantly goes back to the Harfoot village nearby. We then get to see the joyful frivolity of the semi-settled Harfoots in their village, which is set up just outside the harbor town. We see the Harfoot children chasing each other while the older Harfoots are dealing with business, both with each other and with some human merchants wandering about the village. Marigold overhears a group of Harfoots and storemen talking about the coming disasters and pulls herself away from her path to listen. They're talking about the signs in recent days, the river flooding, that comet that appeared a fortnight ago, not to mention Mrs. Cassia, who is Marigold's grandmother, has had a horrible feeling about the lands to the east for some time now. Indeed, the other Harfoot man says, whatever happens, you can always trust Cassia. I dare say we should have left these lands weeks ago. Go meet up with the stores to the north of there. He elbows the storeman next to him, and they all raise their glass as if to toast. Well, you know me, the storeman says. I'm always willing to help you guys move up with my cousins. But it seems wrong to entrust your comings and goings to weather and the joints of an old woman. Suddenly, the Harfoot men become silent before the oldest speaks up. Pseudo, I'm going to forgive your ignorance this once, but don't ever speak so poorly about Mrs. Cassia's judgment again. Marigold smiles at this and stretches forward to get a better look at the men talking. But in doing so, one of the Harfoot men sees her and calls her out. Hey, Marigold, what are you doing here? Oh, you know, I just heard you talking about Granny and wanted to make sure that none of you were bad-mouthing the best Harfoot family you'll ever find. The Harfoot man shakes his head. Has anyone ever told you you eavesdrop too much, little girl? Little? I'm nearly come of age. Nearly is one way of putting it. In either case, you shouldn't be listening to people you have no business listening to. Well, if you didn't want anyone listening to you, you could have chosen a more private place. Go inside that building. That's where you get all your drinks anyway. Ah, says one of the other men. If your family's so great, why don't you spend more time with them? A wonderful idea, Marigold says, and does a mocking bow as she retreats towards the other side of the village, closest to the river. We see the Harfoot men shaking their heads as she leaves before returning to their conversation. Marigold goes to a group of her friends and family who are drinking at an open table as a couple of pigs are walking past. Ah, Marigold, her mother Amber says. Did you pick up the vegetables from the market? Marigold puts a sack of potatoes and leeks onto the table. Yep. And I found this really cool snake in the water. Oh dear, says her father, Rondell. Please tell me you didn't bring this one home. Marigold then pretends to be offended. Of course not. How could you think I would do such a thing? Anyway, I saw this really awesome elf in shining armor in the town. Her parents look at each other and her mother says, there are plenty of elves around here, dear. What made this one so special? He came from the sea, and he glowed. Suddenly, her father acquires a rather grave look on his face. Do you think we'll be able to talk to him? He seemed really special. We're going to have to tell your mother about this, Rondell says to Amber. That's another bad omen. When the shinier elves start arriving, it means there's trouble brewing in the land. Which reminds me, Amber says, we need to go back to the house. The apples need picked and the flowers need watered. Which reminds me, Marigold says. That healer lady was asking about us again in the town, and I told her she could come around in a few hours before sundown. Ah, good, Rondell says to Amber. That woman has become your mother's favorite customer. I hope we'll have enough herbs for her. In the next scene, we are introduced to Bronwyn, a southern healer and tradeswoman who became a part of the town a decade or so ago. She's speaking with Cassia about all the herbs their family has available, and luckily she has been able to find most of them. Wonderful. As always, your help is most appreciated. Let's see. Oh, it looks like I just have one more thing on my list. Do you have any sage? Cassia frowns. I'm afraid not. We used the rest of it a few days ago and haven't had the chance to gather more. However, we could grow some if you would like. I'm afraid that won't work. I need quite a bit of it, and it'll have to be within a few weeks or so. Is there any way you can get it in that time? Of course. The other families wouldn't even know where to look, but my girls have a knack for finding these sorts of herbs. You come back in a week or so. I'll have my girls get enough for you. Are you sure they won't mind? Mind? My dear, they absolutely love camping out in the field and forest gathering herbs. Ruby in particular enjoys clover and sage, much like myself when I was her age. She calls all the Harfoot children of her extended family together and tells them that Mrs. Bronwyn needs sage, and the family needs a short list of other herbs as well. And you better be quick. I expect you all to be back within a week. Understand? They all nod. Good. Now who would like to go? Marigold volunteers first, along with her sister Ruby, and they quickly get on their ponies and ride off into the forest east of the village. We then cut to a shot of Gil-galad approaching the great tree once more. The courtyard is empty and silent. There's a somber atmosphere over the whole thing as he sorrowfully touches the great trunk once again. He looks pensive, and after a few moments, Elrond steps into the courtyard. You called, High King. I did. I've been thinking on the words of this Elendil as well as your own and combining them with my own study. What the envoy says is true. This world has been fading rather drastically for some time now. I do not wish to contradict you, High King, nor the wisdom of the Valar, but I have lived for many years with the sun as well, and have not detected so drastic a decline as this envoy seems to imply. If I may be so bold, it is often said that urgent business exaggerates one's perception. Would this not be merely another example of this? My dear Elrond, you have spent much time in the lands long blessed by the presence of the High Elves, and now you spend your days within Lindon, the greatest of elvish realms still on this Middle-earth. It is no wonder that the corruption which has spread throughout the world has not been felt as keenly here. He then turns to the tree again, and once more gently touches its trunk. A touch of sorrow washes over his face. Even so, Lindon will fade, Elrond. More slowly perhaps than the other realms, but she will fade. We have had far too little time in this Middle-earth. He then turns once more to Elrond and says, but even more than this, we must realize that other realms will feel this failing much more keenly and quickly than we will. We cannot look merely to our own good, Elrond. We must also help them as well. What do you propose we do, High King? I've decided to send you to Eregion with Galadriel and Celeborn when they leave. The envoy of Valinor spoke of how the arts of Ale may be our only hope, and the elven smiths of the Gwaith Meridain are now the greatest craftsmen outside of the West, in some ways surpassing even the great smiths of the Noldor and Beleriand. Go, and see if you can find a way to delay this corruption. I am afraid that it cannot be wholly stopped. But even 1,000 years more in this world would be a truly glorious thing. It will be done, High King. We see Galadriel, Celeborn, and Verrix getting ready to leave as Elrond comes to them. Each has their own entourage, with Verrix having gathered all of his people. We see that many of them have learned how to speak in basic Sindarin, and even some of their clothes are more richly woven after gaining the time and resources. Elrond and Verrix exchange a few words of pleasantries, and Galadriel asks what Elrond's purpose is. Elrond notes that it would be a long explanation that would perhaps best wait for when they have reached Eregion for fear of burdening them with a second hearing. Celeborn merely smiles and points out that they have a long road ahead of them, and he would not tire of hearing his friend's voice twice over. Finally, we see Marigold and several of her cousins gathering various herbs. We see that they've been doing this for a while, and there's some relaxing banter between the 6 of them. Ruby clearly looks up to her older sister, but is actively discouraged from following her too closely by the other girls. Marigold doesn't seem to mind, but does move away from the rest of them and enjoys a bit of peace and quiet among the trees. We hear her singing a walking song, but as she does this, she notices that there are no birds or other animals in the area, which she finds odd. She investigates further and finds a large amount of slashing and burning towards the eastern side of the forest. Immediately, she rushes back to the camp and tells everyone to leave, presenting evidence of orcs in the area. One of her cousins tells her that Ruby is missing, having gone to search for her, and so she goes up to a hill to look for her. She calls out a few times and is eventually able to find her, but in the meantime, she sees a large band of orcs heading directly to the town. We then cut back to the stranger, who is still sitting within the elf tower, reading various reports about the surrounding area as well as looking over several maps. We see him like this only for a few moments, but it's clear that he has been doing this for some time, and it is also clear that he is greatly disturbed and troubled by what he reads. His thoughts are cut off, however, as an elf named Erendir comes into the room. The stranger bows briefly to him, though it's clear that he does this merely as a formality. My lord, I thank you for the hospitality of your men, and I apologize for any further questions I must ask. Lord? Yes, I suppose I am a lord after a fashion. My friends tell me you are a high elf from the sea. What would you have with us? Well, I am afraid I cannot disclose my task. My masters have commanded secrecy, in addition to urgency. If it is any comfort to you, I did not intend to come this way, and I have no quarrel with you or your people. Indeed, Erendir says. I should hope that you have no quarrel with us, for my people have done all we can to keep ourselves distant from the elves of the West. I know of no ill will my people bear towards you, but be that as it may, I am an envoy to the elvish realms, and I must deliver a message with great urgency. An envoy? By whom were you sent? That, I'm afraid, is something I cannot disclose, save to those to whom I bear the message. Arondir pauses as he looks at the stranger, while the stranger seems to likewise be examining him. We see a great difference in the shining light of the stranger's eyes compared to the relative darkness of Arondir's. And yet there is a spark of light, as if some hint of the elder days rested within him. I see, Arondir says, that you are from the west indeed. We have heard tales about the great works of our long-sundered brethren in Beleriand, but rarely do they come into our midst. We have had little time, as elves reckon it, to build a friendship with our distant cousins. But they have left us alone, and we have paid them the same courtesy. I, likewise, intend to leave you to your ways, for it is not my task to correct or even examine the customs and laws you have established within your own lands and among your own people. I only ask that you help me find passage to the elven kingdoms to the north. Arondir raises an eyebrow. North, you say? Do you not know that a great forest sunders those lands from us? I have read it, and you intend to make the journey in any case? If I do not, many could die, and a great evil will certainly befall this Middle-earth. Arondir once more pauses, as if to examine any hint of deception within his eyes, but eventually nods and leads him out of the tower. Just as they leave the tower, we see Marigold galloping as fast as her pony can carry her to the elves. Orcs! She screams. Arondir stops her and asks what she's talking about. I saw orcs coming, Mr. Elf. Arondir ignores the strange address and asks with a hint of suspicion. Very well. Where are they? They were in the forest. They're in this huge pack. I don't need those details, Marigold. I just need to know where they're going. That's what I'm trying to tell you. They're coming towards the town. They're coming here? Arondir pauses. Then he wakes into action, commanding the lord of the town to rally the guard together. He calls his own soldiers, and then he demands exact reports of the orc movements from his scouts. He points to the nearby hills outside the town and the woods as their points of defense, but points to the tower as the fallback point for the elves. After he has given these orders, he approaches the stranger. If it please you, my lord, I would have your help in this battle. My aid is yours to command, my friend, and it seems we may yet have more to discuss once the battle is won. It is then that they hear the horns of the orcs, and see smoke rising from the hills from which Arondir had pointed only just before. We then see the orcs descend from them, and Arondir looks around to see another, smaller orc band approaching from the forest to attack the town. Confusion flashes across his face before he looks around and calls to 3 of his elvish commanders. Estion, Lendor, take the scouts and assist the humans holding off the smaller orc raid. If you can, defeat them in the field and direct the tower guard over to the main battle here. Maethor, take some of your archers and defend the tower. Send all other soldiers and guards out to meet the orcs on that hill. They cannot pass it without becoming surrounded, so they will be forced to engage. With any luck, the men will deal with the smaller force easily and be able to assist us. Mr. Elf, Marigold yells. What? Our archers will be able to help you as well. I sent for them as soon as I saw the orcs. Arondir smiles. It seems that you have not lost your quality of being helpful when need demands it. Thank you? Arondir begins to rally his forces together, and the stranger draws his sword, looking towards the main hill to the east. Distant though it is, we watch him as he sees a figure cloaked in black, standing upon a black horse amidst a group of similarly dressed men. They seem to be watching the orc and elf movements intently, though contributing nothing to either side. The stranger then joins the rest of the elves. The orcs from the forest reach the town first, and would have begun slaughtering the townsmen had the elvish scouts not arrived in time. The elf, named Estion, in particular, shows his abilities to guide each of the households into the walls quickly, while also getting the town guards and lord's soldiers arrayed, while Lendor uses his group of elves to pick off and confuse many of the orcs before they even reach the town. The town guard, having already been alerted, begins its defense of the wall, and it becomes clear rather quickly that the orcs are no match for a prepared defense, and they begin looting and burning the town outside the walls. One of the local nobles rallies together a section of the wall and charges out to meet them. A skirmish begins where said nobleman becomes injured. It is then that we see that Bronwyn is on the battlefield, conducting a small safe area near the walls and healing all the men she can. Thank you, my lady, the nobleman says. Bronwyn smiles at his courtesy and slightly bows her head as she begins to treat his leg, which has the largest wound. I've sworn to preserve the lives of those I could. I consider it my honor to do what I can for you. The main battle, however, is on the hill, where the elves and Harfoots, as well as a few other men, have had barely enough time to reach the hill before the orcs are on them. The orc army isn't massive, likely numbering no more than several hundred, but the elves are so few in number that it proves difficult. We see Arondir's skill particularly as a commander, directing the elves and Harfoots towards focusing on major targets and tactical maneuvers. We also see that he is a skilled fighter, taking out several orcs in a Legolas-style scene. When we see the stranger fighting, however, we see that he is in a league all to himself. He cuts his way through dozens of orcs throughout the fight, and the longer he fights, the more he seems to glow with a white light. Hidden as if behind a thin veil, the fury of his gaze casts all the orcs into a frightful dread of him. Within minutes of fighting, the orcs realize their numbers have starkly dwindled, and as the stranger continues to cower them with mere looks, to them it appears as though one of the rumored gods of the West have come to Middle-earth seeking vengeance upon them, though to the eyes of the others it merely appears that he is an exceptional fighter. The orcs begin to rout, and as they do, the elves charge towards them, the stranger leading the charge, and what will to remain in the fight amongst the orcs breaks. A few horsemen chase after them, killing as many as they can before reaching the forest, while the stranger looks towards the hill. The cloaked figure, casting a certain dread upon the town, seems to stare intently at him. Arendir notices this as well. That orc chieftain does not look pleased with the result of the battle. The stranger watches the cloaked figure, and for a moment we merely see the two of them facing each other over the great distance. But before long, the figure and those around him turn and disappear behind the hill. That is no orc chieftain, I'm afraid. It's something else entirely. One thing that I realized in the recording of the audio for this episode, and just something I wanted to add as a little extra commentary towards the end, Bronwyn, in both my version as well as in the original show, is a healer. That's how she is described, and that's how she's meant to be portrayed. And yet, throughout the entirety of the actual show, she never really does any healing. The closest thing that ever happens with healing and Bronwyn is that her son and boyfriend, I guess, have to cauterize a wound to make sure that she's still alive. We see her making various potions and fragrances and medicines and herbs and things like that in her house, but she never continues the practice throughout the rest of the series. And the reason for why I mention this is that in the writing of this script, I just naturally had Bronwyn healing people because she was a healer. In my mind, that's what she was supposed to be, and so I just naturally added scenes where she would go around healing people. Now, in the context of the story, what that actually means is that she is going to be healing soldiers in battles that are going to happen throughout the course of the season. But I guess, I don't know, it strikes me as lazy and another example of the show just simply being poorly thought out. I don't really have much to add to this other than that. I'd rather keep my own thoughts about this story more or less to myself and allow the story to speak for itself, as it's more or less how I think stories should go. In any case, I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you next week for the next episode, I promise. Let's hope this is a promise I can keep.